So, hey everyone, welcome to episode 2 of Off the Pitch, a GISB podcast. Through this podcast, we interview various leading sports management professionals within their areas of expertise. This podcast aims to support people to sort of enhance their knowledge of the business of sport and how they can enhance their career in the industry. So, coming to what we're going to talk about today, not just in sport, but across all industries. India is considered a sort of a sleeping giant and a market with tremendous potential and opportunity for global and international brands. In the sports hemisphere itself, we've seen multiple entities try and penetrate the Indian market over the last decade or two, whether it's tennis and Wimbledon or basketball and the NBA, baseball and the MLB, and of course the number of football brands, giant European leagues like LaLiga, Premier League, Bundesliga, as well as multiple franchises like Man United, Liverpool, Barcelona, to name a few. So what we're going to talk about today is how these international entities can establish themselves in India. We've seen them take multiple approaches, and we've got perhaps the most ideal person to talk about this today, somebody that's worked with a number of international sports brands, Mr. Vivek Sethia. So just to introduce Vivek, Vivek is the co-founder and CEO of India on Track. India on Track is a sports agency that works both in sports development in the forms of setting up and running training academies, as well as in the sphere of sports marketing and consulting for numerous international as well as domestic brands. And more recently, Vivek's also become a great source of sports content and news on Instagram, and I highly recommend that everyone check out his Instagram page. It's very, very informative and very, very entertaining. So welcome Vivek to Off the Pitch, and thanks for taking out your time to chat with us today.
No, thank you. Thanks, Arjun, for having me. Really looking forward to the discussion. So where do we start?
So to kick off, when it comes to international sports entities, what is the opportunity that India provides them? Why do they want to establish themselves, in this market?
See, at the end of the day, it's all about the fans, right? How you monetize the fans is where the key is. So if you look at the top revenue streams for any sporting entity, it's a television product, it's sponsors, and it's gate revenue and licensing and so on, merchandise. And eventually all of these are consumed by a fan, right? So the fan has to eventually pay for all of it.
Yeah.
Now, if it's getting routed through a broadcast organization or a sponsor, that might be a different ball game. But why would a Chevrolet sponsor a Manchester United if they were not able to leverage enough to be able to sell more Chevrolets, right? So eventually the fans are paying. So if you look at the outside view of India as an economy, not just for sporting entities but any global organization, they look at the population, and they look at the size of the middle class, and you look at the growth of the economy year on year, of course pre-COVID, and then you look at the growing middle class. You also look at the increase in the disposable income of the middle class. It becomes an attractive proposition for any global organization to look at this market and then try to access it and penetrate in it, and then eventually commercialize it. Now, some organizations have been able to do it instantly, and some unfortunately haven't been able to. So when it comes to sporting entities, it's a long haul.
Yep.
Right? It's India is not a market that will bear fruits right away. So, but to answer your question, at the end of the day, it's this fan base that these organizations want to create, and eventually, whenever that eventually might be, eventually commercialize this fan base, monetize it, and potentially make more commercial opportunity. So that's really the play here.
Right. So, and like you said, it varies for different entities. Some instantaneously, some most for the long haul, and I'm sure it varies across sports as well, depending on the kind of interest levels that exist over here. So, do the objectives change for different types of sporting entities? Whether it's a league, an international league like a La Liga, or a franchise like a Man United, or a federation for that matter?
I don't think the objectives would change. I think the approaches will change dramatically. So let's take an example of two different sports to begin with.
Right.
Then we'll take example of one particular sport and we can go into so on. So if you take the example of an MLB versus so a baseball versus a football, for example, right? Now, the inherent quality of baseball is that we have some similarity to a bat and ball. We have tremendous amount of talent in cricket, and there could be a potential for somebody to potentially be able to play baseball well as well. Some talent to be potentially able to play baseball.
Right.
But the reality of baseball in India is that the popularity of the sport is extremely, extremely limited. The participation of the sport is also fairly limited, and there isn't enough knowledge of any significant international brands. So MLB is not popular, or so there's some popularity of New York Yankees, but that's more as a style icon than a baseball club, really. I mean, it's their logo that everyone kind of recognizes. So if I'm MLB, the objective is still the same: create fans in India, build a base in India, grow their brand in India, and eventually 5 years, 10 years, 15 years down the line, that can be commercialized, right? But the approach here is that if we start just brand building and just putting money on building from the ground up, it might take 10 years, 15 years, God knows how much, and that still needs to be done.
Yeah.
But a good way of approaching it is that can we actually groom some talent in India and get them to play in MLB, right? And the minute that happens, the Yao Ming effect of NBA in China kicks in, and maybe people will start tuning in to watch an Indian play in the MLB, right? So it might be a very different approach from, let's say, a LaLiga, where they would know that realistically, if they want to rely on an approach where an Indian player plays in Spain, is probably more unrealistic today. It's definitely a hope, and it's definitely something we all are working on.
Yeah.
But that cannot be the founding principle of the approach towards India, right? And the approach has to be completely different because the sport doesn't really allow for it to be there. So end objectives are fairly similar for any, like that would be for any business, right? And even if IPL goes abroad, that would be the approach or the objective of IPL as well. But I think the approach really varies. And if you take the example of Premier League versus La Liga, right? Premier League's approach is fairly different because they are a much more established brand in India, at least, I mean, still. But if you look at 3 or 4 years ago, before La Liga started investing in the Indian market, it was definitely, Premier League was far ahead of La Liga when it comes to brand recognition, right? So if you're a leader in the market, if your brand is the most recognizable, their approach has been that how can we get integrated in the Indian football ecosystem far more, right? Whether the approach is grassroots or partnering with ISL and so on and so forth. Whereas if you look at La Liga, they are a European league that many can claim is as good, if not better, than La Liga on the pitch. Many can claim if it's as good or not better on the marketing front or as a brand or so on, right? There are regions where La Liga is bigger, there are regions where Premier League is bigger, right? So you're an organization that you know that you're a distant second, right? But globally, you're not a distant second. Globally, you're up there. You're either better or maybe a close second. So their approach has been a lot to do with focusing a lot on fan creation, lot of engagement, lot of digital activities, lots of fan activities, lots of leveraging their assets and tools, their players, their legends, their clubs, and a harmonious approach to building the market. So it's a lot around building the market, right? And they've caught up quite a bit, I would like to imagine, over the last few years that they've invested the time and money. So it's a more investment-driven, fan-driven approach, right? And I'm not saying one is better than the other. I'm just saying organizations are in different situations. So now if you come one level lower, if you take the example of Manchester United, they haven't really done much in India as against some of the other clubs. Because they also know that they have two very distinct advantages in India. Number one is that obviously they have the highest fan base amongst all the European clubs,
right?
And that continues to stay loyal to them, if not grow, but continues to stay loyal to them. And second is they actually have lots of Indian sponsors. like Apollo, like Gulf Oil, like HCL, and so on, that are doing lots of work, and even their global sponsors are doing lots of activations in India. Whether it was Kohler and so on. So they are relying on their sponsors to invest a lot of money in activating, which eventually become Manchester United activations, right? So we work a lot with the Polo Tires, and they do tons of activations with the fan clubs. That helps creating new fans. That helps kind of engaging with the existing fans, building their affinity, and so on.
Right.
But they know they are in the leadership position, and they can kind of get away because they have sponsors from the market, and they have such a great fan base that they can get away by not doing anything more. But if you look at some of the other clubs, whether it is Chelsea or City or Arsenal, for example, they are investing a lot more on digital activations or fan engagement. I mean, you'll see clubs even like Sevilla Football Club wanting to do various different things here. So eventually, the objectives remain the same. The approaches are different depending on where they are, and it's a very interesting time to be in because the market is interesting for all these entities, and different entities looking at a different kind of an approach to get to the same result at the end of the day.
Right.
And time will tell which of these organizations evolve as leaders and winners, so to speak, and which will not do as well.
Right. I mean, so like you said, it is all about the fans. Regardless, the objectives don't change. The approach will definitely change. But from how would you say India is different from the Western market? Is there anything specific that entities need to keep in mind? Anything distinct about the Indian sports fan?
I think the Indian sports fan is extremely unique in the sense that we are probably the most when it comes to value for money, and we are also very, very pampered with free stuff.
Yep.
Right. So the Indian sport fan might, if you look at the fan cycle, right, from creation of a fan to from creating some level of affinity to creation of a fan to engagement of that fan and to keep the fan, and then eventually monetization of the fan. So if you look at this journey, the journey might be fairly similar of an Indian consumer than any other Western consumer or Southeast Asian consumer or whatnot. But when it comes to monetization, that path of from pre-monetization to post-monetization is the longest for an Indian fan. Right. And it's not really our fault as fans. It's just that how industries have evolved in our country, that we are used to free stuff. Like I'm a UFC fan, and I have spent so far in the last 5 years I've followed UFC. I have spent 480 rupees total on UFC, and I've watched every single. And I have spent 480, but I have consumed potentially $10,000 worth of content, right? And that I think as a fan in India, that thing this is my right, because just free stuff. So I pay 10 rupees for my Sony, and maybe whatever 200 rupees for Sony Live, and I watch all content, which would normally be $10 pay-per-view up to $150 pay-per-view per event, right? And I consider myself as a hardcore fan. Right. So, but if tomorrow UFC introduces pay-per-view in India, I don't know how many of people like me who are hardcore fans are going to be able to watch the same amount of content. We might still watch some of the content, right? So I think the biggest challenge that a lot of these international entities face in India is that when will this switch to monetization happen, right? And this switch to monetization is where the play is. So imagine you're going into a game, you know what to play, but you don't know when you're going to win or if you're going to win, right? And there's no clear path around it. But there is a hope that there will be a win, because the hope has been generated by IPL. There is and to some extent some of the TV deals or sponsorship deals done in Kabaddi. But the hope is that you have a property where multi-billion dollar TV deal is struck, and also a property where an average consumer of India, a lower middle class person or a low middle class income group person doesn't feel that much of a problem in spending 2,000 rupees of of going and experiencing a live match.
Right.
So if a product is in the hearts of the country, people will spend money. That case study has been kind of proven by IPL to some extent.
Right.
And that's really the only case study. And
Right.
everyone else is hoping that there will be a switch. And I don't know if you recall, you'd probably be younger, but in the first few years of IPL, that was not the case. So there was a lot of free ticket distribution.
Yep.
People were very resistant in spending the money. And I think it was only after fourth or fifth season is when people really started realizing that this is genuine entertainment, and I would take my family of four and spend 7,000, 8,000, 10,000 rupees to to experience a proper match day. That's like my monthly celebration, so to speak, or whatever that might be.
Yep.
Right. And even the clubs started really thinking of ticketing as a serious opportunity, where they stopped giving freebies and so on. So I think that's where an Indian fan is very different. Is when will that monetization happen, right? When will we start really buying the jerseys of Sevilla Football Club, or getting an Indian, or when they can get an Indian sponsor from us?
Right.
I think that's where there's a big question mark. And the clubs that will have the long-term vision and the patience, and it's not easy. It's not easy because executives are not evaluated on visions, right? Clubs could be. So if you're the CEO of Arsenal today, you'll have some commercial pressures, and you'll say, let me invest X amount of pounds in India. And if that return is not coming in 1 year, 2 year, 3 year, 5 years, how long will you be able to kind of continue to convince your board that India is a great market for future, right? So it's not an easy decision, but organizations like LaLiga that have the long-term vision to build the market will succeed. So a great case study for LaLiga is that they've invested a lot of resources in fan building and fan engagement and content creation and digital engagement. And after 3 years now, they have 2 sponsors from India. They have BKT Tires, which is a global sponsor, and they have Dream 11. And of course, they have a project with us, which is the football schools project. Right. So eventually, it does. There is definitely a potential for things to pay off. But yeah, it's a long-term patience game.
And I mean, the hope definitely exists. The case studies of IPL and more recently BKL with the sort of media rights being sold in that way. But yeah. I mean, for the time being, with digital on the up and up in India, is there a play for direct to consumer monetization for international sports brands?
See, in my opinion, all broadcasters across most properties, most international properties are not making. Indian broadcasters that have these assets are not making money on these assets, right. Whether it's Formula One, whether it's the Grand Slams, whether it is the UFC, whether it is Premier League. I mean, so normally what happens is there are 2 important reasons why any sporting property would want to go direct to consumer. Right. One is that they feel they can give them a better experience than a broadcaster is giving. That's option number 1. So they can be closer to the fans, collect more data, get more interaction, get more engagement, give a better experience, and so on. And second is that they feel that there is more money onto the table, which they are not getting. So normally, if 100 rupees is on the table, then the broadcaster will make something, right? In an ideal world, right? So let's say if I'm a sports rights holder, and broadcaster is giving me 50 rupees, and I feel that there's 150 rupees that the broadcaster is making. I feel the relationship is unfair, that I should go directly to the consumer and make that 150, right? The challenge in India is that both these things are not true. So the first one is that for a rights holder to improve the relationship with fans and improve a consumer experience, a lot of tech investment needs to be in place, and a lot of marketing investment needs to be in place. And I don't believe India is right now in a position where an organization should make that kind of investment, in my opinion. If they have the money to invest, they should invest in various other fan engagement, fan building protocols and ideas. And second is that no broadcasters are also in the hope that this will become big in the future. So they are working with, with the rights holders, and they're not really making too much money for the rights holders to feel. So they're actually all losing money. So if there was a pie of 50 rupees, the broadcaster is actually paying 100 rupees to the rights holder and taking a 50 rupee loss, because they might see the potential in the long term, or they might see the potential in the brand value of that property. So if I'm Star Sports and if I have Premier League, I have a brand of Premier League with me, right? I might be willing to make some money somewhere else and lose some money on this, right? So, so I think direct to consumer might be a little tricky at this stage. But I think what is interesting on the direct to consumer bit is the non-live content. And I think that's where clubs, especially that are owners of that content, not the leagues, can really benefit from the Indian market. So the Indian fans are really they are starved of behind the scenes access, or they're starved of access to players. They're starved of good content being in India. And I think a lot of non-live content, whether it is locker room stuff or practice training stuff or just funny stuff or interviews or whatever, I think franchisees, especially clubs, can try to go direct to consumer on that, and to be able to monetize that in the near future. That's definitely an opportunity.
And is that something that sports other than football that aren't popular here, for example, the MLB, can take into consideration? We saw the global effect that something like The Last Dance had on Netflix in terms of the spike in fans for the NBA.
Yeah. So imagine if MLB had proper operations in India, just like they are. I mean, they had pre-COVID, and of course with COVID, they still have operations here, but things are slow. Imagine if they had that when the $1 Million Arm movie was released, right? And that's what I meant by, like, how do you actually use the power of some of your content to create spaces in the hearts of the fans. To me, that was so powerful, that whole exercise, and then that all of that culminating into a movie, and then the players having gone there and the struggles that they had there, and eventually also making it in some sense. Of course, they're not professional baseball players anymore, but yeah, that's an opportunity for some of the smaller sports in India as well, or some of the leagues that have lesser presence in India, to be able to generate that kind of impact. And I think real stories on the heartlands of India and genuine storytelling is immensely powerful. I mean, even if you watch programs like Kaun Banega Crorepati or Indian Idol or whatnot, like why they become so engaging is that these are real stories of real people in India, right? And these are actually not people like you and me, to be honest. This is stories coming out of heartland, and if sport can get into that storytelling and legit genuine storytelling at that level, then that's amazing. And of course, there are certain sports which are more where this can be more natural, like a baseball potentially. But if this is Formula One, probably not, right? Because to find those kinds of stories is difficult. But that's really the opportunity, and that's where I guess for an international brand coming into India, that's where it's important for them to understand the pulse of our nation from that perspective, and that's where the heart of our country lies, really.
And it's very interesting that you say that. Generally speaking, India is referred to as just this one sort of nation and entity, that's this one big opportunity. But in reality, India is, it's so much more than a country. It's a continent. It's got 29 states with, diverse cultures, and, split between the urban population with people of means and the rural population, the heart of India, the difference between India and Bharat. So, so how can, is in your experience, would sports entities take this top-down approach and say India, or would they look at specific regions? And would you advise them to look at the rural areas as opposed to the urban and developed areas to get to the heartland? Because from an outsider's perspective, it seems as if the urban cities seem to be the hubs of fan activities.
Yeah, see, it's not. I mean, it's not a one-off answer, unfortunately. So, um, the reality is that the so of course you're absolutely right that India is not one India, right? I mean, if you really start slicing and dicing it, you might actually look at our country as, 30 or 50 different subsectors, and depending on how you slice and dice it, right? So you can say English is one category and urban is one category, and then regional can be divided into so many, whether it's languages or geographies or so on. So it's not an easy answer. I mean, India is not an easy answer. So sometimes, so for example, if you take the example of Sevilla, I think and we were not involved in this, so it's not like any pat on the back for ourselves. But the approach of partnering with a club in Bangalore, which is not necessarily a fancy big ISL club, and not necessarily going full national, fits really well with their strategy of saying that let me attack a region of India, let me attack India in a way of micro um, uh, geography. Let me attack India from the perspective of 5 lakh fans, a 5 lakh target audience, and grow from there, right? Because that's what my means allow and that's what my brand allows, right? Because if I go national, but that would never be a strategy for Manchester United, right? The way they are and their brand is and so on. So it is not necessarily always top down. So we are, for example, right now working on a project with Pro Panja League, Panja Arm Wrestling, right? It becomes an obvious sport to take to the masses of the country.
Right.
Easy sport to understand, quick to execute. You and I can start on a table, and so it's more natural towards that kind of an approach. But certain sports don't allow for that. Like if you're advising to a golf or even to football from that perspective. So football in the urban markets is more top down, but in the footballing markets could be bottom up, right? So if you look at Northeast or Kerala or Kolkata or whatnot, like if that's the approach. So um, it's tough to really categorize it in one. It really depends on the brand, depends on the sport, and so on. But I would like to highlight here the work that NBA has done, and they have been actually quite successful in taking a dual. I don't know what their official approach would be, but just looking from the outside, that they've taken a fairly dual approach. So they've taken an approach of NBA, the brand NBA. It's sexy. Yeah. It looks amazing. How they present themselves digitally. The involvement that the global has with India. Legends coming to India all the time. The games came to India a couple of years back. It's all like just, it looks amazing. It looks sexy. The way they produce the shows, the way even they produce the shows in India and so on. But if you look at their grassroots work that has gone in, the junior NBA programs, the schools program, the academy work, they have set of coaches going across the country year round, just building the brand, working on the basketball stuff, supporting the Indian athletes, supporting the Basketball Federation of India, supporting the state federations, supporting the schools that are big on basketball, giving free classes, investing heavily on improving the quality of the sport, investing in infrastructure. It's like real hardcore approach to investing the sport,
right,
in the sport, right? And I guess that's a dual approach that they've taken. And don't get me wrong, it comes with a lot of investment and a lot of vision and visionary people who look at India and say that I don't care about the next 10 years, right? I care about the 15th year, and what can we do to make that investment. And again, don't get me wrong, lots of brands might want to do that approach, but might not have the kind of investment that is required to be able to do that, or might not have the vision at the top to be able to do that. But they've done a phenomenal job in actually covering both the bases, and they've been able to really achieve the growth, even though they have some inherent problems that the league happens early morning, and for people to wake up who are not fans, it's a little difficult. So yeah.
No, yeah, but just goes to show that the long haul is definitely what brands should be looking out for. There's a certain, sector of sports fans that tends to often be overlooked, and I'm talking about female sports fans. So, and the big three leagues, sports leagues in India, have a sizable, female viewership. So, is there anything that international brands can do to capitalize on this market?
There are a couple of challenges here that we have. One is, if you look at women's sport in general, and then you look at female fans for probably male leagues or so on. I think there are two different issues here, but they often get intertwined, unfortunately, right? So there is a lot of movement, especially on the football front, soccer front, globally, around equal pay in sport and so on. And there are, of course, counter views. I just want to address that, and I'll come back to your question. So this obviously started with the US soccer team, women's soccer team, saying that we win everything. We are the world champions. 4-time world champion, 3-time world champions. We have crowds in our stadiums and so on and so forth. But still, we don't get equal pay to the men's team, which is, according to them, in shambles. If India was at that level, we would be very happy. But they still get significantly less paid. So I'm not that naive to say that everyone should be paid equal, because it depends on the commercial reality of a sport. So, right. For example, a tennis female player in India might get paid more than an Indian arm wrestler, a male, right? So it's not about female or male. It's about the commercial viability of that sport, right? So if Indian women cricketers are getting less than men cricketers, then the unfortunate reality is that people are watching the male counterparts more. Right. But they still might be making women Indian cricketers might still be making far more than our archers, for example, right? Or our gymnasts, for example, right? A male gymnast in India would be making less than female cricketers, right? So you can't say it's not a blanket statement, right? But having said that, if you take a particular sport and you see male and female in portion in that, especially if you look at women's soccer in the US, they still get disproportionately less paid than what the viewership proportion might be, in my opinion, right? So if men viewership is 100 and the commercial opportunity is 100, and they are getting paid according to 100, and the women commercial opportunity is 60, then they are still not getting paid as per that. Right. And so that's a challenge. Now, what happens for international, and that comes back to your question, is that what happens for international brands is it's a very sensitive and a tricky topic, right? The minute you start kind of dealing in this, you better be committed to taking a strong stance and making some investments, right? And it's best to be avoided at the moment for somebody who doesn't understand the sensitivities of India, sitting 6,000 kilometers away or 12,000 kilometers away, and say that, listen, let's just promote as unisex. We are promoting our league, we're not going to do anything extra for women, because we don't know how the nuances work. We are still brand new into the country. Most of these organizations are only 3 to 4 years into, except NBA, which is doing a lot for women's basketball as well. And it's too little a time to understand the nuances of our crazy country, right? So even though there's a portion of population of the viewers that is female, there are few female viewers, it's just easier to kind of stay away from it. And second is that also understand that the budgets or the investments of these clubs or organizations is not like multi-million-dollar, right? So if you have limited resources, which it should be, don't get me wrong, it should not be more than that. It should always be a situation where they test out certain things and see how it works, and then only increase their investment if it makes sense. If it's limited, then to actually segregate marketing becomes very difficult. Right? A more holistic approach becomes easier. So I understand where they're coming from. I think female fans and female sport, women's sport should really be pushed, especially women's football in India, because we have a realistic chance to play the World Cup in our lifetimes. And at least in my lifetime, you have probably 20 years more than me. But um, I think a lot needs to be done and a lot can be done. But I think the onus is also, the rhetoric is also driven by our own country, right? Like, it will be naive for me to say that La Liga should do something on women's football when AIFF isn't. I mean, come on.
Yep.
So, and La Liga, when it comes to India, or Premier League when it comes to India, they will also see what is happening in the country and where the investment is worthy of their time. So, I think we need to really look at sport as multi-gender, whether it's on the fan side or the athlete side or the league side or the ecosystem side, and then expect something from international organizations. I think we just do, as Indian, as part of Indian ecosystem, we don't do enough,
right,
for us to expect something from international organizations.
Right. And it's going to be commercially driven always for international brands. So wherever the money takes them is where they're going to spend their limited resources.
But here's the thing, Arjun, like, we somehow think of that as a bad thing. Like, I don't know why nobody questions Airtel charging 800 rupees a month. Why is that okay? And for Manchester United to come and say, I want to sell jerseys, not okay. Since when has that happened?
Yeah.
Why is this undue pressure of doing free and the right thing? And right is defined by the fans, not by the organization. But on sporting entities, I just don't understand this. It's just baffling. I've been debating so much on this. Right, I run a grassroots company, and people say, you charge for training. I was like, yeah, I charge for training. How am I supposed to impart training if I don't charge for it? Right? They're like, we don't know, but you charge for training. That player is such a good player, but you're charging 2,000 rupees a month for training that player. Okay, but how am I supposed to train that player without charging the money? And that's when organizations that are charitable in nature or that are driven by CSR money kick in, and which is great. If I had that money, I would take that route, right? But we have history, apart from a couple of ventures which are like Sesa Goa or some of the legendary ventures of Tata Football Academy or so on. There are no ventures that have sustained, because when you start taking charity and the charity stops, what happens to the project? It just dies. And this whole pressure of providing sports for free is unreal in the world and unreal especially in India. Right. And the sports industry can't evolve if we don't think of this as a business. It is eventually a business, and people like you and me who want to make a living off of this, right, will need to make some money in order to create a living. And we don't want to, and people like you and me, if we don't go into the industry is not going to improve. Right. So it's a vicious circle. Either you have bad people who are willing to just do it for free through some charitable processes, and the industry will never approve, or you get professionals into the industry.
Yep.
And you and I will, for our passion of sport, can take 10%, 20%, 30%, 50%, 70% cuts of our salaries. I took a 98% cut when I moved from Deloitte, New York to Sports in India. 98, no exaggeration. But beyond a point, how long is that going to be sustainable? I have to live a life. एक गाड़ी चाहिए, एक घर चाहिए, rent pay करना है, bills pay करने हैं. Commercialization of sport as a more of an industry as against a charitable angle.
And that's something that needs to start with us over here in India. We can't rely on the international entities to do this for us. It's only then that their inputs can sort of support us.
I consider them in the wrong for saying that I entered India for a commercial objective. Why not? Is IPL not a commercial objective? If you ask ISL, would you like to make money? Will they say no? If you ask Kabaddi, if you ask badminton, if you ask Saina Nehwal that you make 20% more, will she say no? If you ask Neeraj Chopra that can you make 5 more brand endorsements, will he say no? What's wrong in it? Why is money bad? Like, why is it bad? If it's done ethically and if it's done legally and if it's done properly, why is it bad? It's not bad.
Right. So just to finish this off, last question I want to ask you is, if the question was reversed, if we had to take Indian sports or sports leagues to the West, the United States or Europe, and IPL, or maybe a pro kabaddi that that's more of an Indian indigenous sport in its truest nature, what differences do you see in going east to west as opposed to west to east? Is it just the same? I could see similarities between an NFL and a kabaddi and try and leverage things like that, or how would you go about it?
So I think the difference would probably be that we would have a little bit of an advantage for indigenous sports because we have Indian communities everywhere, right? So if you take the example of kabaddi, and kabaddi is big in Punjab and Haryana, so I would be tempted to take it to Canada or the UK and start serving the Indian community as a baseline target audience, right? And then look at growing the sport. Imagine the challenge that MLB has in India, where they don't even have a base of 5,000, 10,000 players, right? Or an audience of a few lakhs, right? To catch on to as a starting point, right? The starting point is almost zero. Whereas if we take kabaddi to, let's say, Toronto, right, we'll have a starting point there. We have the Indian communities, we will have certain players that will evolve off of there, and to commercialize that is probably a better starting point. And I feel it's natural progression for cricket and kabaddi to evolve internationally, but I believe in cricket, BCCI might be tempted to continue to grow in India because there's still a lot of growth available. Even after all these numbers, the switch from Sony to Star was kind of unheard of in terms of TV numbers, and there's potentially more growth. And only when growth starts stagnating is when you start looking at different markets and so on. I mean, they definitely can still, but I think kabaddi will be more natural because it's the kabaddi league will own the sport far more than what BCCI can say that they own across the world, right? And to go to where Indian communities are in a bunch of countries would be a natural kind of progression, and I guess we'll face less resistance than some of the international sports coming in.
Right. Great. Thank you so much, Vivek. It's been great getting your insights on these topics, and thanks everyone for watching, and all the best for the upcoming season, and hopefully business and everything else picks up as well.
Hopefully Barca wins the league despite losing the both the Clásicos. Cool, man. Thank you so much. Thanks everyone for tuning in, and thanks Arjun for the time. Appreciate it.
Thank you.
Bye.